Yachting is one of New Zealand's strongest Olympic sports, ranking 4th for medals in the Summer Games. Last year in Paris, our sailors grabbed a silver in the 49ers and bronze in the NACRA 17 mixed multi-hull.
New Zealand crossed the finish line in second place. McCarty and Mackenzie are going to take the silver medal for New Zealand. They won silver at Tokyo with Peter Burling and Blair Tuke. And that legacy of success continues for the country.
Bronze for New Zealand. A little bit unexpected. I don't know what their goal was, the New Zealanders. But Wilkinson and Dawson.
But away from the podium finishes, it wasn't all smooth sailing.
The Sport Integrity Commission is dealing with multiple athlete welfare, cultural and conduct complaints within Yachting New Zealand and what is set to be the first major test of the new agency's muscle.
So I guess issues have been bubbling away under the surface for several years now, but they really came to a head last year during the Olympic selection process for Paris, and Yachting New Zealand were accused of mishandling its selections for the Games. They had a number of selection disputes, some played out behind the scenes, others were quite public.
The complaints come as Yachting New Zealand undertakes its own review of the past Olympic cycle. This is following a series of messy selection disputes for the Paris Games.
Yachting New Zealand has the dubious honour of being our first sporting body to be taken to the newly minted Sport Integrity Commission, launched just last year. The investigation will look at least 9, probably more, complaints concerning culture, athlete welfare and conduct. The body's own internal evaluation by former New Zealand Olympic Committee head Karen Smith had already revealed problems with cultural issues, a lack of transparency, perceived favouritism, a mutual lack of trust,
and also a perception that leadership operates within a traditional paradigm which may not embrace modern, inclusive or innovative approaches.
So it's old school.
Yes, a nice way of saying old school.
That's RNZ sports correspondent Dana Johansson. I'm Alexia Russell, and on the detail today, what's going on at Yachting New Zealand?
It's nowhere near as bad as it looks, and Yachting New Zealand is always the whipping boy.
Later I'll be talking to the editor of Sail World, Richard Gladwell, about the tricky business of gazing into a crystal ball when it comes to choosing potential Olympic champions. But first, Dana has the inside story on yachting's selection problems.
I think that the insular nature of the sport and some of the conflicts of interest that exist in the leadership and the setup is actually what's made issues get to this point, and that they've blown up in the way they have because they haven't had the processes in place to address these things early, and that's possibly because there is a bit of groupthink happening.
Yachting New Zealand last year faced criticism over athletes selected for Paris in spite of not qualifying. Star 49ers crew Molly Meach and Joe Allais, who failed to achieve a top 10 placing at one of the designated selection regattas. And it was rebuked by the Sports Tribunal over a decision not to select kite foiler Lucas Walton Keim, who technically did qualify but wasn't nominated by Yachting NZ.
The tribunal upheld his appeal, but it was quite complicated in the sense that it was upheld on a very, very narrow point, in that they ruled that Yachting New Zealand had relied on one or more errors of fact when they came to making their determination. So they basically referred it back to Yachting New Zealand to consider his selection case in light of the revised facts. There was a bit more toing and froing, and eventually they came to an 11th hour resolution, and Lucas did go to the Olympic Games. But what that decision did find was that Yachting New Zealand had followed its selection criteria properly. They ruled that the selectors had acted properly. It was just those kind of narrow points around whether they'd had the right results in front of them.
But Lucas had qualified.
Yes.
But Yachting New Zealand didn't want to nominate him.
That's correct. Yes, so Yachting New Zealand has quite strict selection criteria. So you may have also read a lot around the top 16 rule that the New Zealand Olympic Committee imposes. So the first step to being selected for the Olympic Games is qualifying through the international body. Then the national body has to nominate them and put their name forward for selection to the New Zealand Olympic Committee. And then the New Zealand Olympic Committee will confirm that selection, but they have to meet their own standards in there, and that is top 16. However, Yachting New Zealand imposes a stricter selection policy, and that is that they require their sailors to demonstrate that they are capable of medalling.
Now, there are other selection factors, but they're not made public, and some of the selection criteria are a bit loose.
So Yachting New Zealand are the only national body or Olympic sport that do not publish their selection criteria. So if you were to go on the New Zealand Olympic Committee website, they have every selection criteria for every sport except for yachting. And so I have asked the New Zealand Olympic Committee about this, and it is because Yachting New Zealand believe that if the criteria were publicly released, then other countries could get their hands on that criteria and potentially try to interfere with selections by knowing that this is the selection regatta for New Zealand athletes for the Olympics, or we might try to just get ourselves in between two of the New Zealand boats and make sure that the kind of what they perceive to be the least competitive boat gets through. And this has been the argument put forward for a number of various Olympic cycles.
It's a bit of a long bow, isn't it?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of people that don't really agree with that premise, and that perhaps other countries will be more concerned about their own own Olympic ambitions.
We're so good that we can win the regatta and stuff up New Zealand.
Yeah, I think that everyone's more focused on just doing the best they absolutely can rather than trying to meddle with New Zealand's selections. But it is in breach of the New Zealand Olympic Committee's own selection regulations, but clearly they've given them a pass on that one. But while they're not publicly released, every sailor that is going for selection or is on the long list has access to those documents. And this is where it all kind of sort of blew up last year, and there was accusations that some crews in fact had not met the selection criteria but were nominated anyway.
There was Meech in LA.
That was the women's 49er FX crew of Joe LA and Molly Meech. They did have a top 6 finish at a World Championships, but that was not one of their selection criteria, selection regattas. So at their 2 selection regattas, they had something like a 12th and a 34th. And so everyone was delighted that they were selected because clearly they have an incredible pedigree. But some people in the sailing community saw this as a sort of bending of the rules for some people, and then somehow they were, alleged that when it suited Yachting New Zealand that suddenly when they didn't want someone to be selected, they then sort of said, well, the selection policy is very clear. And the other thing that happened last year is they had an additional clause that allowed athletes that they considered to be sort of future potential medalists in Olympics down the track to a slight relaxing of the rules, so they could in fact be top 16. They did not have to demonstrate that they were medal capable.
So that's common in quite a lot of sports, and athletics does that.
Yes, absolutely, and that is part of the NZOC's wider sort of philosophy as well. However, there was allegations that this was applied inconsistently. So some sailors fit in under this clause and others didn't, but it was never really clear of what this emerging talent clause or what you needed to do to prove you were an emerging talent.
And are there some categories that are more favoured than others? The relatively new sports of kiteflying, that kind of thing, are they on the back burner as far as Yachting New Zealand is concerned? Do we not embrace the new stuff, or is that not an issue?
Certainly if you ask people from some of those classes, they do believe that Yachting New Zealand is quite traditional and tends to support those traditional classes like the dinghy sailing, the skiffs. But equally, there's been a lot of mixed messages from world sailing, and that at one point in time it looked like board sailing or windsurfing, those classes were going to be done away with in future games, and then they sort of reneged on that and actually said, no, this is the future, and we're going to introduce kiteflying as well. So there's been a lot of sort of toing and froing on what the Olympic classes are actually going to be, and they tend to change each 4-year cycle, and that can be really difficult to know where to commit your resurces.
You've got to second guess the Olympic organisation.
Because you're not really just working to a 4-year cycle, you've got to think 8, 12 years down the track. So certainly it did feel to some people within the windsurfing community that they were being abandoned. I think at the 2016 Games in Rio, we had no windsurfers for the first time in several cycles, and that had been traditionally one of New Zealand's, best medalled sports. When you think of
the Kendalls.
The Kendalls.
The Kendall, congratulations, a gold medal for New Zealand.
A real turning point in my life was when my brother won the bronze medal in Los Angeles in 1984.
So I do think that there's definitely the perception within the yachting community that Yachting New Zealand's been slow to embrace these new classes and tended to focus on the traditional ones.
And one of the complainants is a windsurfer, is that right?
Yes, so one of the only complainants that has publicly confirmed that they've made a complaint to the Sports Integrity Commission is a well-known member of the windsurfing community, Bruce Trotter. He's a Grandmaster world champion. He competed in the 80s heyday with Bruce Kendall and the likes of Aaron McIntosh, and he's sort of been involved behind the scenes for quite some time. And he was quite outspoken last year around some of the selection issues, and in fact he had warned Yachting New Zealand that their criteria, as he called it in his expert legal opinion, was dog shit. Did
he go to university to learn that term?
Yeah, I've adopted it as my own. And so he's kind of rallied a lot of the community behind it to I guess use this as an opportunity to finally kind of address some of the issues that, as I say, have been bubbling away under the surface for a number of years now.
So what is the nub of his complaint?
So his complaint is around the selection criteria. He believed that it was a failure in the duty of care of Yachting New Zealand, and that the selection criteria handed so much discretion to the selectors that actually it was unsafe for athletes because there was so much uncertainty. They didn't, in effect, know what they were signing up to, and it handed all the power to the selectors. He
went on Facebook and was quite explicit about what he wanted to happen here. Quite strong criticism of Yachting New Zealand, and I'll just read you a little bit of what he said. The Sports Integrity Commission's been interviewing sailors who've lodged complaints, grouping similar concerns and deciding which issues Yachting New Zealand must answer to, etc. Here's the heartbreaking truth. I know many people are still too scared to lodge a complaint, fearing that Yachting New Zealand might blacklist them or their kids in the future. And then he goes on to say that under Section 39 of the Sport Integrity and Recreation Act 2023, it's illegal for Yachting New Zealand to retaliate against anyone who makes a complaint. And he's urged the Yachting New Zealand board to, basically pull its socks up in this department and to wake up, is what he actually said. He's raised what he calls a black flag here. Do you think there'll be a lot of support for him?
Yeah, I think the challenge with any big investigation like this is maintaining confidentiality and protecting the safety of those who have come forward and made a complaint. And this is the first real big test of the Sports Integrity Commission's processes in that way. And sometimes when, this is happening in a small, what is a small, tight-knit community, people talk and, there's speculation of who these complainants might be. But I think Bruce Trotter's concern is perhaps that's unhelpful and actually unsafe for some of those people that have come forward. And I think he's worried that the kind of chatter that is happening at the moment might deter others from stepping forward. I think he wants to allow the Commission now time to really step through all the issues, talk to people they need to talk to, and there not be this fear, so they are getting the full story, that they're not going to be called in another 2 years to try and unravel more mess.
Do we know how many complainants are involved?
RNZ reported before Christmas that there were around 5 complaints, or it had confirmed 5. We can now confirm there's 9 confirmed complaints, but I believe it to be more than that. But 9 is the number I'm able to confirm.
Selection controversy is not an issue exclusive to yachting. It's something that's been seen in other disputes where top-level sport is essentially run by tight-knit communities, including the parents of participants or past top competitors.
Yeah, I don't think we can read anything into Yachting New Zealand being the first and therefore somehow the worst of the lot. Certainly it's all to do with timing, and the Sports Integrity Commission was established in July 1 last year, and that was right about the time as all this was kicking off in the yachting community. So really it was just kind of right time, right place for some of these people that were raising concerns.
Yachting New Zealand just gets caught in the middle, and it doesn't really matter what they do. They're always the one that's at fault.
As well as writing for and editing Sail World, Richard Gladwell has competed in Olympic trials and from 2004 to 2012 was on the board of Yachting New Zealand, working on the Olympic Committee. Yachting New Zealand CEO David Abercrombie wouldn't talk to us for this podcast, so we asked Richard for some insight as to the inner workings of the body.
Well, the issue is that there's several layers that go on in there. I mean, the first layer is Sport New Zealand, in terms of what they're prepared to give each sport for funding, and that's based on a program. And then the people that are in that program have really got to go out and qualify their country for the Olympics to get a place. And then there's another layer that comes in there from the Olympic Committee that used to say, well, you had to really be guaranteed of a top 10 place in the Olympics to warrant selection. And so when you start playing all those off against each other, it becomes very difficult, particularly when you've got people that are on the borderline of selection.
And then you have to work out what the weather conditions are going to be like at the next Olympic venue and choose athletes to suit that. For example, in 2008 in China, where Tauranga schoolboy Peter Burling made his Olympic debut, predictions for the venue were for light airs.
In 2008 and also 1988, there were criteria in there for sailing that you had to be well performed in light airs, and of course in Qingdao in 2008, where that was a criteria, it turned out to be the heaviest regatta in terms of wind strength since Korea, and Korea was also a light air venue, so you can go through and not select people on the basis of that criteria and then proved horribly wrong afterwards.
Well, and that's the thing about yachting, isn't it? It's conditions on the day and it's gear failure. It's not like running where you've got a time or you've not got a time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the other issue too is when you compare it to, it's different sports like athletics, rowing and cycling. I mean, the people that are doing the selecting there have got a very good idea of what time you've got to achieve to be at a world level, and if you can keep repeating that time and training and all that sort of thing, you've got a very good chance of going through. Rowing are notorious for basically starting these squads up, realising they're not going to make the grade, and then collapsing them down and putting them to some other event that they think is going to have a lot better chance. Whereas in yachting, you can't do that. I mean, you've got to make the choices probably 2 years out from the event, maybe further. And once you're locked into that, you've got to commit funding, and you don't really know how that's going on. But the thing's turned on its ears since Olivia Podmore died, because what Sport New Zealand now seem to be saying is that, we want people to go, everyone to go that's for whom the sport or the event in that sport is qualified. Well, that means that you're going to be taking people that are probably top 20 in the world, and they're not out there outside that top 10 in the world, and they're certainly outside you being able to put your hand on your heart and tell the funders that these people are medal quality, which, it's very hard from Yachting New Zealand's point of view to run a program that is not getting increased funding to take people that are qualified in all 10 events, which, happened in 2016, and they only took 7 out of that 10.
And of course, it's a great big cycle, isn't it? Because if you then don't come home with a medal, you get less money.
Yep, and the other problem with that is that on very rare occasions do people win medals at their first Olympics. So you're in a cycle there where you've got to put people in for development. They go through their first Olympics, they don't medal, and then they've got to come around again and say, well, look, we want to send XYZ because they've been through the hoops once already. We know they didn't make the grade, but we think they're going to make the grade this time.
That's another interesting thing about selection too, isn't it? You have to know who you're dealing with. You have to kind of know their personalities. How determined are they? How, will they not give up if they reach their first sort of hurdle? And yet you have to maintain a distance from them or you're accused of cronyism, getting too close. That yachting's such an insular sport, if you know them from school, they're more likely to get in. How do you balance that?
Well, that was one of the issues that came up after the 2004 games when New Zealand came back without a medal. And when you went through the what was happening there with the squads and all that sort of thing. There were people in there that, we called lifestylers. So in other words, they'd become very used to working within the Olympic lifestyle. They were getting funded for it. All they had to do was go in and make a, good case, and they would, get the funding. Though people you liked or you thought had potential, they would get the funding, and so on and so forth. But of course, when you got through into the Olympics, you realised the horrible truth. And that may have also been the case in the, build-up to the Olympics where, suddenly that year, while they'd performed, quite well and, you thought they had merit from previous years, suddenly, the form wasn't there. And it gets very hard to, turn around to those people and say, well, look, your results this year haven't been particularly good, we're not sending you. When, they can then turn around and say, well, look, I've done, really well in this regatta here and this regatta here, in previous years. It's just a matter of, me going to the Olympics, and I'm sure I can deliver that.
I think one of the real challenges with yachting is it's incredibly expensive. Like, if you think of the cost of a 49er, like a skiff, a basic model 49er, I've been told, is in the realm of $100,000. Now, if you've got two crews competing in the men's class, and then two competing in the women's class or campaigning, and then you've got sales and you've got upkeep and you've got to ship that around the world to get to certain regattas, it's incredibly expensive. And to try and make these decisions of where to apply resource is really hard. And so I think that's where it can get really challenging for the leadership of Yachting New Zealand, because they only have a certain pool of money, and they've got to make decisions quite early on in the cycle of who to commit that resource to. And sometimes they might get it wrong. I think, there's a lot of times where people have been like, that I was never given a chance, but equally you've got to make those hard calls and someone has to do it. So I think that's where it gets really challenging. But certainly I think they do need to do a better job of consulting.
It is pretty hard, and the problem really arises with people in their first Olympics, and it arises with young people that are still there with, very strong parental backing, and of course they're getting a lot of friends and support and all this sort of thing. So a lot of pressure goes on, the personnel at Yachting New Zealand to, pick these people, and because they've ostensibly got potential, and maybe they have.
Yachting NZ was given a funding boost just before Christmas last year thanks to its 2 Olympic medals in Marseille, from $3.98 million to $4.2 million. But both Dana and Richard point out that in sailing that doesn't go far. Meanwhile, the coroner in the Olivia Podmore case has been asking questions over why disputes over selection have to be so combative. And a lawyer involved in that case has suggested removing the lawyers, with athletes and selectors sitting down to talk over their decisions.
We just assume that these types of disputes, they just get combative because that's just how it has to be. Like, it's a kind of,
it's a competition, isn't it?
Yeah, one side against the other. But some of the questions that have been arising, and I've never thought of this myself, it was brought up why, like, you go to the sports tribunal, fine, that's absolutely should be a right and part of the proper process. But why do you need to get lawyers involved? Why do you need to make it this big kind of courtroom drama. Why not be like, give the tribunal all your notes, all the information you're working off, everything you need, say, I'm here, ask me anything, like we're here to answer your questions. It doesn't need to be this big legal drawn out fight, just leave it in the hands of the tribunal. But it seems to get kind of really nasty.
That's it for today. The Detail is a Newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thanks to Dana Johansson and Richard Gladwell. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Phil Benge. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite.